Okay, Dane Rose here for week 33 for all of you that are joining me for the entire 52-week series of a year of exceptional growth and hopefully a lot of well-being. Now, in this week, we're looking at the topic of resolving confusion, shame, and pain. Pain being a very broad definition in this context. And I'm blending and borrowing. I'm actually doing about 8 different channels on different topics. And one of my favorite topics of all time is exploring consciousness. And I've just been going into that in the left and the right brain, etc. And so we're bringing a little bit of that energy and a little bit of that kind of style of kind of drawing over here. And these talks are intended to be listened to in sequence, starting with the 80-20 principle of ignoring 80% of what I say. Let's look at a simple area first. Confusion. So there are 2 areas I want you to consider looking if there's any area of your life right now or any area in your relationship or relationships where you or your partner is confused. Confused and sometimes frustrated and not knowing why. And so the first area to look is in an either or. So there's a lot of things. We live in the cultural context of a lot of dualistic paradigms. And a dualistic paradigm says that, basically, is 2 plus 2 4? If you say yes, then it cannot be no. If you say no, it cannot be yes. There is a correct answer. It is 4. It isn't 5. That is the only correct answer. And anyone who says anything else is absolute rubbish. So this is the either or paradigm. And it works in some situations, but it doesn't work in others. And the area that either or paradigm is the most problematic is in an area, it's in areas that are more complex than the thought process used to analyze the area. And that's why one of the cures for an either-or paradigm is to add a dimension. So what do we have here? We have a bridge with a double lane highway. And if you have just 2 dimensions, if you have a 2-dimensional reality, and you have this vehicle here, it can only go this way or this way. It cannot simultaneously move 2 places at once. So if I take this pen here and I say, is the pen moving this way or is the pen moving this way? There would be a lot of argument if when the pen was going this way, I said it was going this way. But in a slightly more dimensional reality, so this is in a 2-dimensional reality where you have this way and this way. But when you add a 3rd dimension, you can now, with this kind of double-decker bridge, have one set of cars be going this way, the other set of cars going this way at the same time. Now, this may sound, and is, incredibly basic and simple. But if we understand that there are multiple dimensions, and then we add to things for example, the dimension of time and the dimension of space. So you add 3 dimensions, then you go to time, then you go to space, then you have different reference points, the fact that we're all looking at different things. We start to get to a level of complexity that makes it very likely that we would have a conversation that, for example, government handouts equal people dependent on welfare. And then you have someone else say government support leads to better health and higher GDP. And these sound like they're in conflict. And they could be, or they could not be. I spent time in Copenhagen and not only found that I didn't meet anyone who was unemployed, I didn't meet anyone who didn't love their job. I learned later that there are more billionaires per capita in the Nordic countries than there are in the United States. And no one disliked their government. And it is a socialist democracy where they are paid money to go to college. A great college, have free health care, free housing if they need it, free unemployment if they need it, free housing if they need it, free maternity leave for both parents. I mean, this is a complete commitment to be there for the citizens of Denmark. And they're one of the 4th happiest countries on earth. So this is obviously saying something for the health of a country that comes when a government is fully and 100% committed to its citizens. On the other hand, we have other stories in different countries, particularly where the commitment is partial, where you have to, have a kid to get government support, or you have to get sick beyond a certain threshold to get government support, where you do these things and it's limited. You have, in those environments, situations where individuals are, quote, gaming the system. And so you can see that both are true in a level, in different space-times, and seen from different angles. I don't think anyone would argue with my interview of 30 Danish people and saying, do you like your government? Love it. Do you like your country? Love it. Do you like your job? Love it. Are you employed? Yes. I don't think people would argue and say these people are lying. You might have, you might have someone say, well, have you been to the United States and seen how good it is there, where, you have to get into debt to, $100,000 to $200,000 to go to a good college, where you don't get free health care, where you don't get maternity leave, and have you seen how good it is over there? Well, how many billionaires per capita? Less. Okay, let's interview 30 Americans. Do you like your job? Do you like your government? What a load of shit. Do you have a college degree? Do you have any debt? Yes, I'm still paying off my debt, and it was that. And do you have free housing? Do you have free healthcare? No, I don't. I hate the insurance companies. And there's be a reasonable chance for anyone with an objective attitude. And are you as happy here per average 1 to 10 scale, and happy over here? What about the architecture and going around in Denmark versus the architecture going around the United States? Who would rate what 1 to 10? I think it's pretty obvious to many objective people that the Danes are doing a more competent, compassionate, and effective job of creating a great lifestyle for the Danish people than the United States is for its people. And that's measuring very specific metrics that are interesting to me. For me, the level of joy, the amount of hours worked, the undertone of anxiety, these are things that are important to me. And clearly, on an objective metric, Denmark is outperforming my experience of the United States. It's a big country, of course, but I've lived in multiple states for about 30 or so years of my 43 years, and it's I get a relatively good sense of that. But that is not to say that in a specific area, that's not to say that someone cannot legitimately say America is better. See, because this gets into another area of confusion, which is what I call distinctions. Distinctions are also kind of correlated to the screen resolution. So, the current thing out these days is 4K screens. Why? Because they look crisper, more realistic, and nicer than 2K screens. So why not? Now, the interesting thing, though, about both distinctions and 4K screens is, I want you to imagine a screen that just has 4 pixels. And what 4 pixels means is that every pixel can be, red, yellow, green, depends on the way the screens are built, but, it's the way that a TV portrays an image, creates the symbol of a reality on the screen, is by turning this pixel red, this pixel green, this pixel blue, this pixel yellow, etc., such that in combination, in hundreds of those little on-off switches, the texture and pattern of a face emerges. But the question is, could you see that face in just 4 pixels? Like, what would they be? If this was all green, and we have, blue over here, let's say, this pixel was the color was green, and this picture, the biggest color was blue, and this one, biggest color was yellow, and biggest color is red. See, what we get is a very black and white type of pattern, which might be great for portraying a quilt, but isn't adequate if the whole screen is only 4 pixels in size to portray the complexities that reveal a face, a cat, a tree, etc. It's just not big enough screen. And what we're looking at is distinctions. This screen needs to be around 300 pixels by 300 pixels before complex images can start to look realistic. And obviously, 300-400 pixels is 100 times more complicated than this screen. And that leads me into this area where we have a lot of confusion, and it's about distinctions. A pixel is a distinct module. And the reason 4K screens, I just purchased a 4K screen for movie watching today, is that on a 4K screen, you have 4,000. You have 4,000, and I don't know if it's diagonally, or horizontal. My impression is that in every row, you've got 4,000 pixels, going along the top. And then you got maybe 3,000 pixels going, vertically, creating 4,000 multiplied by 3,000, getting more than 1 million individual things turning this way and that way instantaneously to create the fluidity or the illusion, because they're just on-off switches with each one turning red, green, yellow, blue, etc., creating illusions of that render the impression, the symbol of reality. And what I want to suggest is that the more crude the screen or the choices, the more crude the screen, the more crude the options, the more is lost. I mean, is this a beautiful face or it's not? You've got 4 choices. Is red good or bad? See, red, you may not like this color of red, but when it's turned in every 1,000th pixel, it may bring a little bit of spice to the image. It may help to create a dark, the feeling of black in some context, and you don't even recognize it as red at all. And so think of it similarly as, in communication or in dating. If a woman says, "I like a hard man," what does that mean? Is she talking about erection? Is she talking about something rugged? What does that mean? Versus saying, "I really like it when I can cry and be emotional and have stillness around me, that I don't have to react to him, but that he's holding a solid place for me where I can be more liquid and I feel more secure in that environment." And the way that a person does that is, first of all, they stand still. Second of all, they don't interrupt. Thirdly, they use kind of this gruff tone of voice that kind of tells me they're not too sentimental. And they just kind of sit there as long as I need and don't need anything from me. That's what it means to one particular person. This is kind of the difference between, imagine someone is dictating something and you don't know the alphabet, but they're dictating something in words, and so they're saying, "Love him now." Got that? And you say, "What do I do?" And you say, "You touch the keyboard." You say, like this, you touch the keyboard and random letters pop out onto the screen. And they say, no, just touch the screen," but you have to get it right. Love him now. That's not right. Well, I'm touching the keyboard. Yeah, that's not what I mean. Just, touch the keyboard. Do it naturally. QRSTV, it's not making any sense. Touch the keyboard. Can you imagine how frustrating this is? Because what's happening is the communication The person knows what they want to see and they can maybe read, but they do not know how to communicate at the level of distinction to accurately show someone how to type. Because for them to do that, they need to have a little pointer stick and a chalkboard on the wall that where they point at the A and tell the person first put this, and then they point at the B, and they say tap this and go through it. And you have to, for anyone to translate words into a printed screen through another person, the communication would have to be nuanced enough, particularly for someone who didn't know how to spell, as not to just say hit the keyboard, but hit the A, hit the symbol that says this, tap it for 1 second, then do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. Now, this is where we have a bottleneck of misunderstanding. We have it around sex. If we cannot talk in nuanced detail about the distinctions involved, the little hump of my clitoris like this, run it strong and then slowly up and then like this, not like this, keep this rhythm at this pressure. See, then we get liftoff, then we get transformation, then we get a magical experience. Can you spend time with my little sister down there? No. If that's done after you've had 1 hour, 2 hours, however much necessary of attuned practice with very specific communication, or an incredible empathic attunement, meaning if, in this case, the woman is honest, meaning she doesn't affect her body language in the slightest. She doesn't try and turn her body on. She doesn't try and turn her body off. Doesn't try to communicate any message artificially. She just allows her body to completely erupt. This is another situation where just empathy can lead to some people, facial expressions, this and that, the other, the occasional comment, how is this, to learn the rhythms in the body of a woman. But if that empathy isn't there, which is not the case, well, empathy is discouraged to such a large degree in men in so many areas of the culture that to suddenly be in high practice for attuned empathy, something many men are shamed since birth for having in all kinds of areas, including empathy for their own inner child, etc., that's often been, devastated in this and that and the other way, bullying, shaming, abandonment, etc. The things that an infant goes through in a non-attuned culture in which parents have no formal training on emotional levels and an enormous amount of pressure to dissociate from their child. Tribal parents had little or no formal training, but they had a great impetus to associate and attune with their child. You don't have tribes where men and women go off to work and leave their children in front of little boxes showing images about guns and shooting and, confused about this. And you don't have this kind of amazing emotional dissociation and confusion in tribal culture. You have deep attunement. You have maybe the women have a circle and the children spend time doing this, and they do it together in the rhythm that is natural for a body and a child, not the rhythm that is natural for Western culture. And so in this kind of environment, you may not need to have classes that lead to emotional literacy. But in a dissociative culture where your first 5 years are basically having your own body and emotional rhythms crammed into the cracks provided by an often brutal and insensitive culture, you do need classes in high school, etc., and this and that and the other. And then, of course, they're not there. And so it's no wonder that when we add in the overlay of cultural taboos, what is a taboo? Something that is there, but that cannot be talked about, that cannot be looked at directly. This is an amazing phenomenon, isn't it? Something that is there, but that cannot be acknowledged as there. This is a foundation for insanity right off the bat. I mean, how can you have rape and incest in a family? How can you have alcoholism in a family? How can you have gambling addiction, etc., in a family to such a degree that it is ripping the empathy, the attunement, the safety, the financial security of the entire family apart? It is ripping that apart. But at the same time, it's like a knife. I mean, imagine a knife that's just coming towards you and just destroying everything that you are. But because it is taboo, because it is unspoken, you've got to pretend. What knife? What knife? Punch in the face? What are you talking to? Blood all over the place? What are you talking about? We look at the high rates of mental emotional dis-ease, which as we get older in terms of form, often in dementia or insanity, etc., is a dissociation. A dissociation from what's happening. I'm having a sneezing fit around this, which I've always associated with grief, meaning when I try and notice what happens with spontaneous outbursts of sneezing, there are different topics and contexts in which I will sneeze like mad. And as soon as that terrain in the psyche is passed over, the sneezing stopped, because nothing, it's not that there isn't dust and there isn't the potential to sneeze. I think the potential to sneeze is always there, and there's always some environmental aggravants. The question is why, around certain topics, does the topic precipitate the environmental activants to such a level that I sneeze for 5 or 10 minutes without stop. And the only common denominator in terms of understanding the physiological and emotional crossover, every emotion produces chemicals in the body. Every body, this is a very, very basic truth. It's one of the relative taboos in our culture. Among the scientific community, there is not a single emotion we feel that does not create chemicals in the body to feel it, meaning if we think a thought that precipitates an emotion, it changes our chemistry physiologically. And if we do things like the Botox studies, where they actually froze people's eyes in an up position, eyebrows in an up position, mouth in an up position, and or forced people to smile by putting a pencil in, the studies show, and I can verify it in 5 seconds, get a pencil and try it, that this precipitates a happier attitude. So in other words, if you do happy things, smile, laugh, force your face and muscles, it becomes easier to think thoughts that support those muscles. So there's always a pairing, at least on a subconscious level, between a thought and a feeling. You know, there really is no just, you know, they're very closely linked. Either, you know, sometimes if you feel absolutely dreadful, the first conscious thought is, what's wrong? Well, that's a dreadful thought. What is wrong? And then that sets you off on a pairing of body sensation and thinking. But grief is the thing that seems to precipitate these sneezing fits, which I have from time to time around topics around which I feel grief. I don't always know that I have that level of grief. Like, I had no idea I was stumbling into a sneezing fit because the grief did not present itself as a wave of grief that then led to sneezing. It presented itself as a slight sadness, and then as I was starting to go down into the sadness, a sneezing fit that, in some ways, the way, you know, traumatic coping mechanisms often work is the body and physiology and or addictions serve to distract us from areas we don't know how to deal with. And trauma is one of the areas that we don't know how to deal with, because by being a threat to human life, by definition, see, and the traumatic mechanism of fight, flight, and freeze, and again, reference you to one of the earliest videos in the year, understanding trauma, understanding your trauma scores. Trauma activates the biological mechanism of fight, flight, freeze, survival at the deep part of the brain that is pre-conscious, the reptilian part that is instinctual. And it does that by, you know, the sense of self, and I choose this and I choose that, is designed as a lens to deal with stuff that is smaller than the ego. This is my day. I can walk where I want here, this and that and the other. But when you have a raging forest fire that's burning up thousands of acres, you know, every few days, this is not something the ego has any control over. It's not like I choose to stop this fire. It has no interest in you. It's not even that I choose to outrun this fire. This fire may be rushing this way at 200 miles per hour, and your car cannot drive that far, which means you recognize that you're in a force and in a presence of something that is bigger than your ability to control your own safety. And you anticipate the possibility of the probability of death. It doesn't matter if you die, this will precipitate a traumatic reaction because you're in the presence of something that is bigger than your ego. And because this is terrifying for the ego, the ego's whole way of calming down and somewhat disappearing into the background is loving that ego and making it safe to such a point that it doesn't feel threatened. And then you have a sense of self that is not defined by this harsh us against them, me or not me, I will do anything, fight, flight, freeze to survive whatever it is, but is more of a sense of something somewhat transcendent, where there's deep love and safety. But the ego, terrified as it is of so many things, develops a variety of traumatic coping mechanisms. And what a coping mechanism is, the favorite one being an addiction or compulsion of any kind, is a panic, a distraction from whatever it is that seems to be looming over bigger than the ego, the traumatic memory, which gets frozen in time in the biology of the body, the traumatic possibility, the emotion that's so big that we will do anything to avoid feeling it. When this starts to surface, we create a variety of compulsive responses, from overworking to gambling to sex to lying to sugar to coffee to whatever, with a singular goal. The singular goal being to avoid the overwhelming feeling at all costs through distraction, deflection, blah, 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 blah. And what we deal with then is something like a sneezing fit. So an emotion is starting to come up that's very, very poignant. And last time we were in this terrain as a psyche, particularly trauma leads to regression. So, when you have these moments that are bigger than the ego, you have your life path, your ego is going along, and then a moment or a feeling comes that's bigger than the ego that could threaten the ego. And what the ego does is it dissociates from the present moment, puts the huge feeling or energy out there, and then moves on. But not all of it moves on. Some of it stays frozen at the moment of time of the regressed trauma. And so when that happens, whenever we get too close to the orbit of that dissociated, regressed part, we go back into, we start to fall into the gravitational pull of the trauma, and then our coping mechanism, our reactive addiction, kicks in to make sure that we don't end up alone, overwhelmed, and devastated by the intensity of emotion or the intensity of the memory producing the intensity of the emotion, that we will do anything to avoid feeling. And this creates what seems to be, to an emotionally illiterate culture, illogical behavior. Meaning, if every time someone brings up this topic, I burst into sneezing fits and can barely stop and can never talk about the topic, then an astute observer, hopefully a fairly competent therapist, would say something like, it seems like you have a sneezing fit every time we talk about this topic. Sneezing fit erupts again. No sneezing fit. I don't know what it is. I'm just allergic to pollen. And depending on our personal conscious mind's confidence in the area, it either has to be denied. What I'm remembering right now is a woman who, every time I brought up an important topic at night, which was on when we were sitting in bed, she would immediately fall asleep. And
And I would shake her awake, and I'd say, you just dozed off. And she'd say, no, I didn't. And I'd say, well, anyway, sit up so that you can't doze off, and let me tell you what I was just saying. And she said, oh, darling, please, can we talk about it tomorrow? And then tomorrow would come, and no, I don't want to talk about it now. And then at night, we haven't talked about it all day, and again, I'm going to sleep. Now, I then said, this is a problem. The problem is you are passionately avoiding anything important that I want to talk about, number one. And number two, you're pretending that you're not avoiding it. And she said, I'm not. I want to talk about it. I said, okay, let's talk about it. Oh, and I'd say, you just watched yourself in about 10 seconds disappear. You don't think that's avoiding? No. And it's important to understand this phenomena because while it's hard to tell for sure if someone is not only blockading a whole area of the psyche, but is blockading talking about the blockade, it's pretty hard to be absolutely certain. But what I've come to understand, because I ended the relationship around that and two other blockades that were all similar things, patterns happening. I thought the patterns were destructive. That's fine. That's normal in relationship. Let's talk about it. We could never talk about it because it was always blockaded. And then we couldn't talk about the blockade because the blockade was denied. You know, it's like, okay, there's three topics. I remember our last conversation. I talked with her. She said, "Oh, you're such an angel." And I said, "No, I'm not an angel. You're sticking me over here in this beautiful pedestal, but I'm not up on that pedestal." And then I said, "In a few moments, you're going to turn me into an absolute hell." I said, "I want you to watch how you turn me from an angel into the most horrible person you ever, talked to, because I'm the same person. I'm not up here where you're sticking me now, and I won't be down here where you're going to stick me in a few minutes. I'm here, but you're not with me. You're flipping from this angel devil thing as long as you're not here with me. So are you ready to go for it?" Which you can't say there isn't a blockade, and she's not ready to go for it. So she says she's ready to go for it, and 10 minutes later, she slams down the phone, hangs up, and never wants to talk to me again. What's going on there? Because the same woman would do absolutely anything. I saw panic and dread in her face at the thought of ending the relationship. What's going on there? Why is she so desperate for the relationship not to end? So desperate not to talk about certain things? So desperate to deny there's anything being denied? And then when she can't find a good, easy balance in that, she ends the relationship, which was a predictable enough pattern to be able to say, I wasn't sure if she would end the relationship or not, but I knew I had to take that risk, meaning I knew that if I cornered her to that degree where I said, you're going to turn me into a devil, I'm an angel here, but I'm not an angel. And you're going to turn me into a devil, but I'm not a devil. I'm just going to draw your attention to things that are uncomfortable, that I know you don't want to look at because you fought them this whole time and you pretend that there's nothing that you don't want to look at. But I guarantee you, by the time you look at some of these things, you will do whatever it takes to, hate me and da-da-da-da-da. So I brought her attention into that area. And here's the very, very fascinating thing, because what I was most concerned about was the fact that she laughed, gave me sex, and made time for me when I put her down. In Neil Gaiman's book, The Game, it's called a neg. So what would happen is I'd be kind and sweet and all that, and I was liking being that. I saw the sweetness in her. I wanted to honor that. That's who I am. And I'd give her that, and she would say, oh, I've got to go. And I didn't want her to go. And if I would throw in a neg, she would make another hour of time, and she'd be more sexually aroused, and she would laugh, and she would enjoy the neg immensely. The put down comment that made her look a little dumb. And I had discovered this, not consciously, I hadn't read The Game or anything at that point. I discovered this because I asked myself, I said, I am being more harsh to her than I am to any other person in my life and any prior girlfriend. I said, this is not me. Why am I putting this woman down? So I watched it. I deliberately tried to be sweet like I normally am. I noticed she didn't have time. I felt disappointment. I felt hurt. I felt small. She wasn't making time for my sweetness, for my innocence, for my joy in her presence, for the beauty that is me. She wasn't making time for that. She wasn't interested in that. And this hurt me. And in the bitterness of that hurt, the disappointment, I made a neg, a comment, a little jab. Like, well, you're so important with your, your self-employed business and all that, and all the clients you don't have, and like you're so important. And she laughed, giving me the cue. So I explored that vein a little bit. And for the next 10, 15 minutes, I found myself negging because now I felt great because suddenly she had all the time in the world for me. So I watched this pattern play out, and it was what concerned me because I was becoming increasingly critical with her, and I didn't want to be. I brought it up. I said, I think I'm becoming increasingly critical. She said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. I watched it. You're the only one I treat that way, and I don't like it. She said, I enjoy it. It's fine. I said, I know. That's why I'm doing it. You make more time for sex. You laugh more. You want to be with me more when I put you down. And so I do it because you are training me to put you down, and you are punishing me when I give you the innocence of my love. She said, no, I'm not. I said, yes, you are. She said, no, I'm not. And I said, not only that, I'm not willing to go through another no, I'm not whole thing. We are going to go to therapy. And I'm going to explain this dynamic to the therapist. And you can argue with them if you want. But I am ending the relationship unless you work with me to stop training me to treat you like shit so that I can get my needs met. She's a very submissive person. She opens up to abuse right and left. This was the one time I was fighting for her dignity. I was fighting to treat her better than she was used to being treated or comfortable being treated or treated her own feminine side. She was the first woman that invited me into BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism, etc. And it was the same thing. She was hurting me at times, and she talked about relationships in which men had got off on, tying her up and blah, blah, blah. And then she was really irritating me and something, and she said, well, why don't you slap me? And I thought about it. It would feel good in the moment, but it would also hurt me because I was in love with this woman. And I slapped her, and I said, this thing feels totally off. I'm just feeling the sadness of it. Whew. There was only one thing she fought me deep and hard on, and it was around treating her well. She would rather end the relationship than have me treat her well. And was so committed to that she couldn't even look at the dynamic. And we went to the therapist with her kicking and screaming, I said, I'm going to end it unless we go and see a therapist. The therapist saw what was going on. And then the woman denied it. She was an English woman. She denied it again. And she said that American therapists couldn't understand her. So I couldn't understand her. A therapist who saw the exact same thing was incapable of understanding it. And she ultimately broke it off because I was unwilling to learn how to treat her like a piece of shit the way she had learned to feel and believe that she was. While on the other hand, she's a coach. She's a coach, not a formal licensed psychotherapist, but she's a drama therapist, helping shy people feel better. And this absolutely floored me. And this is how taboos drive us crazy. Because when something is present in a relationship, your relationship with your own body, your relationship with your wife, your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your country's relationship with the rest of the world, and there is an enormous pink elephant that is ripping the relationship apart. And the law is that it cannot be talked about, which means you are asked to be a secret keeper. And finally, you are asked to pretend, to not only not talk about it, but to cultivate such a sociopathic state that you can be in the presence of extraordinary pain, of extraordinary suffering, of extraordinary dissociation. Extraordinary dissociation, where you watch your parents, they're doing this and they're saying this. They say they want this, and they're doing the thing to create the exact opposite. And you try and talk to them, and first they don't even hear you. You say, you're doing this, but you want this. That's a pretty blatant statement. And the response is, I want this, so I'm doing this to create it. No, that's not what I said. I said, you're doing this, which creates the opposite of what you say you want, and you say you want this. No, I'm doing this to create this. So, can you imagine a taboo that's that big? And we our need to chest deep in these kind of taboo insanities in our culture, in our relationships. So the first thing is it can't be talked about, and then people, once they've all gotten everyone to have consensus that this isn't happening, then they start punishing the person who is exhibiting symptoms of what is actually happening. I remember growing up having nightmares, wetting my bed because it was so terrifying to get out of bed with the nightmares, and being so high-strung and hyper is what they called it, that I could not concentrate on school. Coupled with abandonment, games, and kind of sadomasochism with my younger siblings. And I'm 6 years old. Now, one of the things that good healers and practitioners will teach you is that you don't diagnose the patient. You diagnose the environment by the patient. Because the patient will have within them a microcosm of all of the diseases and imbalances expressed without them, because we are interconnected. This American Life, this emotional life, a beautiful PBS series, one of the very rare accidental studies on feelings in a culture that is so committed to not studying feelings that, of course, very few studies have been done, is emotions and thoughts, memes and emotions and physical viruses, etc., are all viral, equally viral. Gary Slutkin, in his brilliant research on the epidemics of violence, finds that healing violence works most effectively, stripping away the cultural lens and treating it as a medical illness to be responded to in the exact same way that he would treat an epidemic of malaria or anything like that. So when a good practitioner looks at a child in this state, there's only one common denominator of all of that. It is terror. It is trauma. And healthy practitioners then look at the environment. When there's a malaria epidemic, when there is flu epidemic, the patient is not the one studied. The water is. Where are these people drinking? Is the feces covered up? Is this, that, and the other? That's what's studied, because we understand, at the peak in mental, emotional, physical health, that the human self, just like every other living organism, wants to be healthy. And that it takes an extraordinary bombardment of primarily social pressures for the human organism in any form to want to be unhealthy. Now, what's the biggest symptom one would expect if a human organism wanted to be unhealthy? Suicide is the extreme case, meaning there are, to my knowledge, only the tarsier monkey, incredibly, going back to an earlier blog on heightened sensitive, only the tarsier monkey in a certain part of the Philippines, in Bohol province, commits suicide. And it commits suicide because these very, very hypersensitive monkeys, which move very, very, very slowly, they move so slowly that you have to watch them. Might take them 5 minutes to move a paw and grasp a tree, and then another 5 minutes to move the other. So as you can see, there's a huge dissociation from their rhythm and human rhythm. Well, in the addictive cycle of novelty, that there's the continuum between boredom and chaos, and in an addictive culture, novelty, something new and improved, is the king of the day, the queen of the day. And so, tourists, after seeing the Eiffel Tower, blah, 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 they need something more novel. So tarsier monkeys, the species that most like silence and peace and stillness and takes 5 minutes to move a hand, is bombarded with tourists because it is novel, not empathic. Wow, a monkey that will commit suicide to avoid being around me is a monkey I'm going to leave in the forest. No, let's take photos and all that. So, but this is extreme dissatisfaction, and it's very, very rare for an animal to commit suicide. So when human beings have one of the leading causes of death be suicide, in the United States, I believe it's around 1 every 20 minutes is dying from suicide. And an enormous amount of energy is spent to just keep veterans of Vietnam and Korea, etc., alive. I met one of the handlers who just says, anytime anyone's near a suicide, they call me and I tell them to drink themselves into a stupor, to medicate themselves, this, that, and the other, just anything to get through the night, because I'm being paid to help the United States government pretend that this is not a problem. And when people drink themselves into a stupor in the privacy of their own home, nobody complains. It's not headline news. Every fucking suicide, the US government has to acknowledge what a crappy job it's doing with its veterans, and in deep psychosis of denial and shameful, stuff worthy of any of my ex-girlfriends. Where do they learn it? Government. We're part of a power structure. We're part of an ecology. We can't face the truth. And these veterans asked to carry our lies and pretend that they're being treated well when they're being treated like absolute shit. Don't feel motivated to hang around just to protect the government from the delusion that it's being effective or ethical in this situation. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is a nice read in this. So it's a miserable situation. By the way, if sneezing doesn't work, tirades of criticism and blame sometimes distract me from the grief of some of these terrains that are poignant, as is the grief that as a man, I've never been allowed to cry with dignity, because I've been told men don't care, men don't have feelings, men just want sex. I've been told that many, many times. And the sadness around having to hide who I am just to be real to a silent majority that don't want to see. Is mind-numbingly painful. And going back somewhat into this terrain, I actually just want to cut to the chase. You cannot deal with trauma, pain, or shame at this level alone, without help, and without an incredible amount of love. And the saddest thing about that statement is that the amount of love that you need to enter this terrain and retain your sanity and your health is more love than this culture, as a statistic, meaning if you're part of the lucky 2%, and I don't mean those with money, if you're part of the lucky 2%, that can cry for 2 or 3 days with honor, that can have someone witness the bitterness of your grief. It can have someone hold you and love you without piling their addictive and compulsive silencing protocol on top of your wound, to shove you back down out of view so that they can avoid looking at their stuff. If you're part, hallelujah. That's beautiful. But I'm sad for the rest of us. And I'm so grateful for my love. I'm so grateful to my partner, Jen. Without her love, without our love, the energy of protection that is created by loving deeply and being loved, I would not be making this recording. I would not be getting anywhere near this terrain in a 10-foot pole. And I might very well be dead in suicide or deep in addiction, because something is necessary to break away from this level of unending pain. And the real crisis around this, I thought I had a solution, which I kind of outlined and kind of wrote about. But that's just kind of the top layer that's frozen over enough to work with. The deep liquid, it's bathing deeply in love and in grief. Martin Prachtel, I think it's in Beneficio's Roses, but certainly in The Talking Jaguar, talks a little bit about the terrain of grief, and in his poem and book on Dust and Tears, touches on this a little bit. Robert Bly, Iron John, in his book about Iron John, a book about men, and some of the poems. I know Robert, if you spend time with his presence, touches on this material. The grief and the sadness that is too big to bear alone. And I am so, so grateful that I have a woman who does not ask me to bear that grief alone. With her by my side 24/7, going into this terrain is the most courageous thing that I have ever done. And the most scary thing for me, having built my own houses, having run my business successfully since age 17, having made millions of dollars, having achieved thousands of goals, having done $150,000 in therapy, having done workshops up the wazoo, having read more than 1,000 fascinating books and research and thousands of hours of meditation and years of yoga. The most scary thing of all for me is realizing that at the end of all that, this was too big to face alone. And then knowing how much I needed support and love, how hard it was to find the pure and generous spirit that wanted to see, wanted to know, wanted to respond, and was willing to go into the deep darkness of that wood together in order to love and be loved in the areas that need it most. So I have ideas that can get you in the shallow waters. And I think they're important because it's so profoundly devastating, the helplessness to be in the mass of emotions this suppressed and this big and all around, because that's what makes it so big. Is if all I had to do was talk with the neighbors and we could share a cry and see it. But the programming is so deep and so thick, and the commitment to not seeing and being seen is so rich and universal that one has to deal with it alone 95% of the time or more, because no one's willing to stand in there with me, including therapists. Sometimes they're the worst. It's a terrain of soma, the body, somatic. I didn't know I was in this topic today until the sneezing fit, because that has come up in this deep terrain enough. I decided to include you because I had no idea when I hit this wall around age 38, 39. I'd done everything on my bucket list, give or take a few items. I'd reached the top of the hill, and this sadness was starting to well up because I had no more workaholism and stuff to justify the distraction from it. And this came up, and I had no idea what it was, because everyone around me told me how lucky I was, how successful I was, how amazing I was, blah, 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 blah. And I felt like I want to die. And so, but more dangerously, more scarily, I didn't know where else to go. I mean, once you've worked with 3 therapists a week, one on this, one on this, one on this, 2-hour sessions, you can't say that, well, 25 grand of therapy a year doesn't cut it, raise it to 50 grand. 6 hours a week doesn't cut it, maybe do 20 hours a week of therapy. And then a third of the therapy was destructive. I would leave there feeling worse. And it's like, you can't, where do you turn when the diet, when the therapy, when the crystals, when the workshops, when the channeling, when the psychics, when the astrologers, when the therapists, when the exercise, when the goal accomplishment, when the money, when the purchasing, when the serene house, when the sex, when the creative projects don't cut it? Where do you turn then? See, this culture has no answer. It's, the American dream, the American lie. Make enough money, buy this stuff, look good, and all will be well. But it wasn't well since before we were born. The repressed trauma, in my case, 2 parents with varying degrees of PTSD, their parents much worse. So you can see there's improvement. It's just, this again why I talked early on about the importance of knowing if you're in that category that's highly sensitive. Because if you are, this is going to hit you 4 times worse. And if you don't know why, and you add to the taboo management protocol of the culture, which is shame, i.e., you don't know why, there's something wrong with you because you don't know, shame. You're feeling intensely emotional, that's something wrong with you too, more shame. You can't deal with this level of pain if you don't know what you're dealing with. And you're in shame. And you're participating in it. You're believing the lie that there's something wrong with you. When all good doctors know, mentally, emotionally, physically, you do not diagnose the patient's disease. You diagnose the environment's disease in the patient. Nature produces 98 to 99.9% healthy, effective, potent seeds across all species, any of which land in hospitable conditions will grow into healthy, self-sustaining, happy, balanced plants, unless they get messed with within the environment, particularly during the developmental stages. Then you can have 98% of the seeds go dormant and die. 98% of a population dies off. When the environment is hostile, you can have complete collapse of a species despite every one of the seeds, the eggs, etc., being birthed in a state that in a suitable environment would do marvelously well. So this is a very, very important point in taking the shame off of the individual and start looking at this is where comparisons between, for example, the United States and Denmark become so important. Or I'm in Thailand because I'm 3 times happier here. I give up $30,000 a month every month I'm in Thailand. That's a lot of money to give up. And it's worth it. It is worth it to be 3 times happier because I'm allowed to play with children without being looked at as a pedophile in Thailand. I'm allowed to be sensitive in Thailand and engaged with more. I'm allowed to be funny and innocent and playful in Thailand. I'm not scowled at half as much. I have 10 times more quality time with random strangers and my lovely sweetheart. So there's just so many things, along with swimming in warm water and stuff, that help me cope with, this amount of pain. But it's the love that heals it. Believe it or not, this may sound like a lot of pain to you, and it is. But 18 months ago, I was 250% worse, just incapacitated. And that's when I met my sweetheart. And why I've often had a saying, it's nice to meet someone at the bottom, and I've engineered that at times. At times I wore only clothes from thrift stores because I wanted to see who differentiates presence and intelligence over appearance. I didn't want to be selected by people who wanted to be around people who looked cool. I wanted to be around people who valued presence. And at other times I've begun first dates with really awkward questions. In fact, my first letter often online includes every single thing I think that most people in that demographic or whatever doesn't want to hear that's true. Because I don't believe in playing games. I don't believe you can be loved. If you are loved because you pretend to be someone you're not, that's not you being loved. That's the pretense being loved. When you are accepted as you are, that's love. Well, you can't be accepted as you are unless they know who you are. They can't know who you are when in a first meeting unless you tell them. And so that's, I'm sure, deeply responsible for, ending up with such an amazing partner. And of course, it's absolutely fabulous, just to meta-converse relating to one of the earlier topics at a much deeper level. It's absolutely fabulous to meet someone at the worst point in your entire life. Why? Because going back to one of the earlier talks, a few weeks ago, the environment produces the point on your internal probability field that you feel and relate to. And when I'm in more stress, more betrayal, more pain, more health crisis, etc., then, because they all kind of go together in psychosomatic symptoms, than you've ever been, you are at your worst, so most irritable, most controlling, most demanding, most dogmatic, most intolerant, most critical, all of these things. And I'm just looking at myself because I keep a pretty good track of what's going up and down, and I'm just seeing I'm at my absolute worst. Well, isn't it wonderful to find someone who sincerely cares about me enough to transcend her own self-centered obsession, which we all have to varying degrees. This is the traumatic coping mechanism in many cases, to actually care about what it's like to be me. Not just care about how I affect her. Because, to the degree that we are self-centered, the question is, of course, do you help me? This is also, of course, why I'm so grateful to have the articulating talent that let me help her, because I'm not into win-lose relationships, regardless of who's losing and who's winning. I don't like them. But we checked in regularly, and she was winning like mad, being in relationship with me, and I was winning like mad. And I just figured if she's winning like mad when I'm at my absolute worst, she's going to be winning like mad when I'm at my absolute best. I don't have to worry about that. I've often used the analogy of take a ship out to, before buying a ship, sail around the harbor in one of the worst storms and see if it holds up. Because if it holds up in the worst storm, it's going to hold up in calm water. But if it doesn't hold up, meaning, if even in a medium storm the thing sinks, don't cross the ocean in it, and be close to the shore when you test it. And I've had this philosophy in relationships for some time. Use the first week of the relationship to stress it in every possible way, as consciously and gently as possible. Meaning I'm not shouting, I'm never going to have children, and this and that and the other. I'm not shouting that because I'm never going to shout. But a woman is going to learn that I have no intention of having children, so why not on the first email, And so these are, stress points and things. And so So I feel very, very lucky in that sense. It's actually gives me a sense of security. I'm now 250% better than I was then. She's grown 3,600% and more. That was just the last take, about a month ago. And there's more growth since then. And so this is wonderful. I mean, imagine how lucky I am to have someone able to love, support, and nurture me at the worst point in my life. I mean, that's lucky in and of itself. But the real luck is the extrapolation. If it works then, it certainly works when it's better. So hooray. Hooray for, we just had our 16th monthsary, the concept she introduced me to. She remembers the day we met. And every month, 1 or 2 days before, she says it's our monthsary, and that's always a great excuse to do something special, and so we do, and so we just had our 16th monthsary. And I'm so grateful. So 33, resolving confusion, shame, and pain. The confusion, and I'll just cover the little surface stuff that I wanted to cover. The confusion is largely resolved by introducing paradigms that have more dimensions than the current paradigm. If you're in this, like, if it's this, it can't be this, yes, it's this, no, it's that, imagine the double-decker bus, you just stack them up and you can have as many cars going in as many directions as possible. You just need at least, 6 to 8 feet for the cars to, not be directly on top of one another. Lack of communication, these are kind of the causes, either or, lack of communication supplanted by projection, invisibility, that's if you don't tell someone what you're thinking and feeling and why you're thinking and feeling and what it means and how it fits into your paradigm and your value hierarchy, they don't see you. What they see is their projection, which is usually what they would do. And I've tracked this a lot in my life because it's an unusual phenomenon for someone to actually bother to learn why people say this or that or the other. And it's covered up with lots of, well, No, they don't. Every single time that I've heard someone say, yeah, and then I've said, you said, yeah, you understand what I'm saying, and they say, yes, and I say, well, could you explain what you see and what you're seeing in me and why and from what angle? And they do it. 98% of the time, it's wrong. And they acknowledge it. By the time, if they can even put it into words, most people cannot put their projections into words, and if they can, they're too shy to, because they don't want to be wrong in a culture that shames mistakes more than it shames ignorance. As long as you hide the ignorance, it's fine. So the invisibility, if you don't tell someone, I'm doing this for this reason because of these experiences that lead me to believe that this is a good strategy. I'm doing it now. This is an update, and here's what's happening. You are invisible. It's that simple. Now that may be fine, but the way to heal invisibility is by talking about what's going on right now, updating it as soon as it changes, and noting the trend. A great one is, I feel love 5 out of 10 for you right now. I might say this to my partner. I feel love 5 out of 10 for you right now. I feel irritable 6 out of 10 right now. next time I say it, a few hours later. Now I'm feeling love 8 out of 10. And the trend is going up. And what's changed is I feel you heard me clearly, blah, 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 blah. The trend is going up. And the next day it's 10, or, so you can look at the volatility. Now you understand what's going on, why it's going on, to what degree it's going on, and how rapidly. Now you've got an accurate stock chart that, no sophisticated investor invests, without this kind of data. Lack of attunement to reference point. This is a big arena in trauma and crisis. Now, you may, like me, have a brain that has a hard time remembering a 10-digit phone number. I do. I forget it in seconds. It takes me a month to start remembering my own cell phone number if I change my cell phone number. And one of the things we're looking at is the brain's inability to focus on a lot of facts at once. So it's actually on this dance, through things. Now, I'm not even going to get into the main talk, because this is, just a piece of the journey towards well-being. But I do want to touch on this one powerful point. When I was going through my trauma, there were a group of therapists that had been involved in a major ethical betrayal and all that, and it just devastated me because of the way it happened, how it played into childhood repetitions, so it reenacted a childhood trauma by the people you're supposed to trust the most, your therapeutic group, and breaking the law, breaking therapeutic guidelines, lying, the whole thing, and then sacrificing me to protect the therapeutic body's self-image. The Human Awareness Institute organization, in their love, intimacy, and sexuality workshop. Absolutely devastating. And what was interesting to me was that in that very narrow traumatic state, I could only focus on a few things at a time, because my brain was so overwhelmed with panic and crisis that there was this fixation phenomena that is part of, it's how we deal with overwhelm. We have wide beam consciousness that absorbs everything in, but when you're flooded with pain, shame, blah, 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 you use narrow beam, sociopathic consciousness, strategic consciousness, to focus on the one thing that you need to get through the day. Many of us know this quite well because there's a lot of pain in our culture. So I was in this narrow beam focus where it was, abandoned, completely overwhelmed and all that. And the one thing that I thought could really help would be for all of these facilitators to apologize for an appalling train of events. And I know from experience that, because everyone sees reality this way, that way, and the other, I knew they were not going to be able to do an effective apology if I just said, please apologize, because I needed more than just sorry. I needed to know that they understood how and why abusing deep therapeutic protocols like not having romantic relationships, with patients, let alone when they're having their first psychedelic experience, let alone laced with MDMA. I mean, this is the most egregious betrayal that you can imagine. And, so this is what knocked me down. Losing my entire community because the leadership wouldn't stand up for the safety and well-being of a deeply traumatized patient that I couldn't drive when this erupted in my body. I almost had a traffic accident, and this. So the one thing that I thought would show so much, in changing was that they could apologize. So I wrote them this 14-point thing. I need you to apologize for these things. And half of them said they weren't even going to read it and just ignored it, which of course collapsed. But all my security was like, I'm safe. I'm safe if these people are ethical and mature enough to apologize. If they can just do this, that means I'm safe. I feel completely out of my depth. Because I didn't know what trauma was. Believe it or not, I had done workshops with these and worked with a number of them, and none of my practitioners ever educated me. This is why I'm making this recording, frankly. It's absolutely outrageous to me that we expect any child or adult to go through a culture this traumatic without even understanding what the word means. And I learned it by a stranger in a cafe at age 40. It's like, what's the logic there? Don't do therapy, don't trust therapists, don't trust your parents, spend time with strangers in cafes? I mean, it makes no sense. But when we latch onto a specific thing, which we do when we are in a traumatic state, you said you would take me to my favorite restaurant on my birthday. Yes, I did, but no. You said you would take me to my favorite restaurant on my birthday. It's my birthday. You're not even taking me to a restaurant. This isn't what I want to be doing. Yes. Blah, 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 blah. No, you see, when someone is fixated, when someone has been hurt, when someone is hung on to this promise, and it may sound silly, but you need to understand that these little boys, these little girls are dealing with giants in a world in which everything is potentially traumatic because it's 5 times bigger than they are, because they have no legal authority or control, because if they tell the truth in some situations, they'll be beaten, maybe abandoned, maybe killed, because people will not believe them, let alone keep them safe, because people don't understand their limits, because it's a very, very overwhelming reality for a young child. And then parents need to feel good enough so much that they're constantly bribing their children into telling them that they are good enough, which often confuses the child as to how bad the situation is. Because often the most egregious parents are the most needy for the child to tell the parent how good they are, so that the parent doesn't feel swathed with guilt and shame. So, the parent abuses the child, then the parent whitewashes the abuse, then the whole culture whitewashes the abuse because they don't want to do anything about it. Who wants to confront an angry, shame-based parent in the United States who's going to sue them? No one wants to in this culture. And so everyone participates in the whitewash. And then finally, the parent, feeling a bit guilty, comes in with a lollipop or something and says, "This wasn't so bad, was it? And then puts the attention on what went well. See, you have a baseball bat. We're not going to talk about the beating. These are, but let's focus on this. This is what matters. You have a baseball bat. You have this. You have this. Here's a lollipop. Now, don't say anything more about this. We're done with this, right?" This is the parent's bribe, and the message is very clear. You don't want to be beaten again. You don't want this and that to happen. You want a lollipop. Pretend this is the line. But of course, it's not how they feel at all. Trauma while telling this kind of lie. They can't. And this is how we bring a level of dissociation and sociopathic insanity into particularly our men, because men cannot feel around this stuff. It's one of the reasons why thankfully, there are not more than about a dozen juveniles being put to death. Thankfully, not more than a dozen in a year in the United States. Children being electrocuted for for sociopathic behavior. Not the culture being electrocuted, not the parents being electrocuted, not the teachers, not anyone else being electrocuted. The children who internalized this abuse. And one of the interesting statistics was that in one of the recent batches, this is how dehumanizing our culture is, of young men primarily, not yet adult, being put to death in the United States. 5 of them had been sexually abused by men, which should tell you how painful that is for an American man, because the boy is shamed for being emotional. Any child can't deal with their full sexuality. Then there's all the shame about being gay. Then there's the fact that he cannot talk to any peer about being sexually molested by another man without the risk of being shamed and humiliated. So in other words, we're putting him in one of the worst possible wounds we can possibly put that boy. And then we're putting him in the isolation chamber of torture in which you cannot in any way grieve or talk about it without being shamed and ostracized, which is how you feel more than anything else now that this has been done to you. And this is an angry, hurt man. It's not yet a man. This is an angry, hurt boy who will go out and hurt the culture that did this to him, and then be blamed for it, shamed for it, and put to death. And on some level, this fuels the anger and the hate, because he knows he's got no place to turn. You think a therapist is going to weep at the depth necessary for that boy to feel heard and protected? Do you think the therapist is going to extend their 50 minutes? Do you think she's going to work pro bono? Do you think she'll do a camping trip? Do you think she'll help deal with the feelings that he can't deal with at night when he's trying to go to sleep and needs a bottle of alcohol? Or is she going to participate in the shame? And because she doesn't, or he doesn't want to pretend, because the therapist wants to pretend that their deeply flawed protocol for responding to something like this is adequate, when it doesn't work, the message always goes to the boy. You did it wrong. This should be enough for you because it's what I offer. But it isn't enough, and I'm not big enough to own it, i.e. the message goes back again and again. The boy got that message when he was raped. You should have been strong enough to protect yourself. Real boys are. The message came up when it didn't deal with the emotions. Real men don't have emotions, blah, blah, blah. You should have been. It's just shame upon shame upon shame upon shame until it gets so thick that the only satisfaction he gets is spreading his dis-ease, the virus created by the culture in himself with the layers of shame-based messages. He is now spreading the disease by making other people as innocent as him feel that level of horror and abandonment. And until we understand what we're doing to those boys by lying about this, because we betray these boys the moment we say that parents can have children without a census on their mental health. We betray these boys the moment there is not a national support center capable of dealing with rape and trauma of any nature, in which any person can be shamelessly whisked away and not returned back to a hostile environment. We betray these boys when we ask them to go to court and relive their trauma in the most humiliating and shameful way possible, with all the shame ringing in their head, while if their perpetrator gets a good enough lawyer, they don't care anywhere, and no one will acknowledge the horror that's being listened to. This is an unimaginable level of betrayal we inflict on these boys. And then, of course, we lament when they shoot up a school. But wouldn't it be interesting if we had a culture that cared enough about how young people are feeling in the culture, that their feelings matter before it reached the point of shooting up an entire school and themselves as option number one, meaning they've had 2,000 conversations with themselves, going over every fucking single choice in their life, and shooting up the school and themselves ends up as the number one choice to get rid of this pain and have revenge on this fucked up culture. Can you imagine what they're dealing with? And of course, we are not emotionally literate, so we don't diagnose the environment by the patient. What we love to do is scapegoat the patient. Another suicide. Isn't it amazing? Why are these people killing themselves? Well, why don't you ask one of them? Oh, they won't tell me? Do you actually sit down for 6 hours and listen? Are you worthy of being told? Do you want to know? Like, I remember my mother, she kept, calling every 5 years. She'd always call up and say, how are you? I want to know everything. I'd always say the same thing. Mom, you don't want to know. You do not want to know everything. You've never wanted to know anything, let alone everything. Oh, I want to know. I say, watch, Mom. This is purely for your own edification. Let's watch how long you hold out. You ready? So here's my feeling and thought about this. No, that's not the way it is. I said, so you don't want to know. You want your version of reality to dictate and supersede what I actually feel and see. You don't last 10 seconds. So why do you call? You just need to pretend that you want to know? And this has changed a little bit, so that went on for 20 years. This has changed a little bit recently, where she actually read one of my books. It's like amazing. The lack of attunement to a specific reference point is catastrophic in a situation like this. When someone reaches a fixated state, it is always a matter of trauma. The fixation is the more important aspect of the strategy. So think of the self as kind of a lens. So the wider the eyes, the bigger the lens. So I've got about 180 right now. Now I've got this. Now, when there's a lot more coming in, pain, shame, etc., than I can process, what the consciousness does is it narrows the beam down, 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 to a point where it can tolerate the amount of pain and shame seen in this one corridor of vision. This is narrow beam focus. Now, once I've got my hand in this narrow beam focus, I can only see a few things at the end of the line of sight. I can only see a few things. That's all I can see. Now, what narrow beam focus means, obsession, someone I've got to walk on this tile, then I've got to walk on this tile, then this, they are coping with overwhelming feelings, often that are in deep denial and deep dissociation around. And the tile walking or the curb walking, or I've got to hop every 3 steps, is not the enemy. This is a ritual designed to distract the consciousness from something that is the enemy until the person receives competent, effective help to process and tolerate the emotion. It is the enemy. And and it creates a profound vulnerability for the trauma survivor, and a profound opportunity. When you're in narrow beam focus, the only thing you can see is what is inside the channel of your vision, and it's very narrow to keep the overwhelm out. When you're keeping that overwhelm out, you're also limiting your focus. And within a limited focus, there's usually 1, 2, or 3 things that you can see that if those go well, you feel safe and you can start widening up your focus. You're not obviously safe to drive effectively when all you can see is this. You've got blinders on because what is being out there is too overwhelming. It's what they do with horses. They put a blinder on to the eyes because if the horse doesn't see, the horse will stay safe. Because if the horse sees, every time a car rushes by, the horse will rear, fall into the traffic, and be killed. So the narrow beam focus keeps the horse alive and untraumatized, because that's really what the blinders are doing, is they are preventing the horse being traumatized by the speed and mass of the vehicles driving by that its brain processes as life-threatening events. The brain of a horse doesn't say, oh, those are safe drivers 99.99% of the time, I will not be hit. The horse doesn't have a brain like that. The horse just says, these are lumps of steel going at 60 miles an hour. Any one of these could kill me. And then the fight, flight, freeze dynamic comes in. And since the freeze is blocked, it's either flight or fright, or flight or fright, flight or fight. Either one is going to throw an erratic movement that could actually endanger the horse's life. And this is exactly what happens to human beings. It's what happened to me. The tunnel vision needed to keep out all the pain. Meant that there were a few things that I could see. Like I knew that I would feel safe if I had an apology. So I asked for an apology. They didn't even respond. One person gave a half-hearted one. Another one said, they're not going to do anything. And then the others didn't respond. This threw me into deeper trauma, only I can't narrow the vision anymore, and it's already too much. I went into physical collapse. My body went into adrenal fatigue, and I just laid on my back for a month. That's the only thing available to distract. And when I'd be out engaging in life, I'd have such narrow tunnel vision, I couldn't be aware of all that was happening, and I nearly died a few times on the road. And this would traumatize me again, because I would realize that my tunnel vision was a danger to myself, but I was in so much pain that if I opened up to any more, I would have to kill myself. And yet the only thing that I could see in my pain was these people need to make this right. They need to be honest. You know, I had a 10-hour recording of all of this happening. And in this situation, what I'm getting at is, I'm not assuming you're unethical therapists, you know, putting your own necks ahead of the safety of your patients. I'm talking about a scenario where someone has been induced into tunnel vision by overwhelming trauma, and they are fixating on one thing. I need some Pepsi. I need the mail answered. The letter isn't coming, Mom. I just checked yesterday. I need the letter answered. I have to do. If you will do that one thing, however irrationally, for the trauma survivor, get the letter, get the Pepsi, get 100 cans of Pepsi. See, if that's in the narrow beam focus, you give them 100 cans of Pepsi, and their whole world changes. Because when you have narrow beam focus, you have a symbol, 1, 2, or 3 symbols that are the symbol, are you safe or not? You've been induced into narrow beam focus because it was overwhelming and terrifying. You're now in narrow beam focus, you have a symbol. Your client has a symbol, your patient has a symbol, your mother has a symbol, your child has a symbol. And if you will treat that symbol like absolute gold, like the most important thing in the world, like determining of half of their health, if you will treat that symbol, whether it's an apology, whether it's a letter, whether it's a new toy, whether it's a hat, whether it's a going to this special event in just this way that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, they will get the message of what that symbol represents. For me, the apology meant safety. Because for them to apologize meant that they had to care more about my well-being than their public image. The fact that they didn't care more about my well-being than their public image was what had put my life in jeopardy. So for them to apologize, it was a symbol that I'm now more important than their public image, which now means I'm safe again. They wouldn't do it. So I went through another year of finding other things until I was able to disengage and put the safety on my partner. And then that was a very shaky thing, because when you've been betrayed by your parents, when you've been betrayed by this partner, when you've been betrayed by that partner, when you've been betrayed by 4 therapists simultaneously, they were all part of a group, and your community leaders, It's like, how do you intelligently trust? When I say intelligently trust, obviously, I had trusted to varying degrees every one of those people that betrayed me, which means that my trust filters are not adequate to keep me safe. Well, while you're traumatized, you don't exactly have time to develop new trust filters. So any new relationship, you're going to be using the old ones, but you can't logically say, well, all those therapists betrayed me, this betrayed me, I'm in absolute nightmare shape. I would have been better off alone. Now let me trust someone. It's like, this is not a logical conclusion. So how do you trust? I didn't trust. I actually entered the relationship in service. I just was so furious that this had been happening my whole life and not a single adult had taken a stand, that I decided I would be a stand for someone I met who I thought I could help. I just did it out of passion that at least someone in my life would be taking care and being kind to someone who deserved that. And so that would be me. And that's probably why, in part, she could tolerate me at my absolute worst. But that it wasn't looking like a relationship. And it's still an ongoing process. But that was a very big awareness that you cannot know what means something And so the answer to this, unless you ask, so, the answer is, when someone says, I need a Pepsi, you've got 10 in the fridge. No, it's not enough. I need more Pepsi. You say on a 1 to 10 scale, how important is it to get more Pepsi in the next 24 hours? And if they say it's a 10 or a 20 out of 10, go and get 50 bottles of Pepsi, because that's cheaper than therapy. It's cheaper than hospitalization due to adrenal fatigue. It's cheaper than just about everything else. I want to take a moment just to kind of honor this diagram, and maybe we'll come back here. But just to review, we have confusion when we get locked in. It has to be this or this in an area that's complex, much more than an either or can intelligently respond to. When we have a lack of a communication, it is always supplemented with projection. The projection is usually wrong, and this leads to confusing behavior. They're behaving in a way that is rational towards the person they have projected you to be. You are behaving in a way that is rational towards the person you are projecting them to be. You are not behaving rationally towards who they actually are unless you take the time to communicate. It takes about 4 hours a day, by the way, to have really deep, multiple dimensional communication and attunement. Maybe a little bit less or more for most people, but it takes me at least 4 hours a day. And in my relationship, if I'm not in attunement, 6 hours a day is the threshold here, because it's a more sensitive time. Invisibility, if you don't communicate what's going on mentally, emotionally, physically, to what degree it's going on, why it's going on, and then provide updates and discuss the trend and what to do about it, you and or your partner will be invisible. Lack of attunement to the reference point in very narrow beam focus as a coping strategy for trauma can lead to spending 1,000 times more energy to get less result than focusing. See, because when you're in narrow beam focus, I want my Pepsi, I want my Pepsi, I want my Pepsi. Someone brings you a warm jacket, but that's not in your focus. It's like, I don't care. I want my Pepsi, I want my Pepsi, I want my Pepsi. Someone gives you a nice card in the mail. I don't care. I'm not looking at that. I can't process that. I want my Pepsi, I want my Pepsi. You give them Pepsi, they feel like it's safe. So maybe they'll open their eye up there. And now once that compulsion has been answered, then they can open up and say, oh, I got a card, and they can relax back into that wider state. But they will not take down the blinders until they get the sense that they are safe within within the view that is in the blinders. It's kind of that mechanism. Then finally, distinctions are the way to resolve most arguments. Just make enough distinctions. As I say, if you lead into a conversation, government welfare is good, government welfare is bad, that's having a 2-pixel screen. You can't see any details there. But if you say, in Denmark, for these 30 people, government doing this, this, and this, and not this, this, and this, has produced this results according to them, you've got to be dealing with a pretty dense idiot who's going to say, no, it isn't. Would you like to talk to them? Yeah, here's their phone numbers. See for yourself. If they don't want to be open-minded, and one of the reasons it's important to understand that we have dogmatic warfare is it's trauma tunnel vision. the one thing that I'm holding on to that's keeping me through all my pain is that Jesus is this, and you come on Sunday and da-da-da. Well, if someone's got that as their one fixed point to whether they're safe or on track or not, then they deal with someone else and say, Jesus is Jesus, and you do it the other day and like this, and that will completely freak them out. There cannot be an intelligent debate here because it is not an intelligent crisis. It is a trauma management system of narrow tunnel vision to manage overwhelm, which is why the understanding of highly sensitive people, etc., is so very important. I'll just cover a couple of points here. One is this is a picture of a person walking, and the way we make progress in evolution is by becoming unbalanced in this way, leaning into the imbalance, swinging your leg forward, leaning on. And in this way, the pendulum swing from extremes is the process of evolution. We have gone from a more matriarchal goddess culture into the extremes of male chauvinism to a point where there's not a single male major religion with even a woman leader, let alone most countries and all that. And we're starting to swing the other way. The imbalances are happening on different rhythmic levels. There's an imbalance every single time we walk. There's an imbalance in every single year. This year is more about work. This year is more about love. This year is more about growth. This year is more about pain. This one is more about joy. There's an imbalance every time we walk. There's an imbalance in every month, in every year, in every day. There's an imbalance in every 1,000 years. There's an imbalance in every 1,000,000 years. And sometimes a lot of these imbalances all line up, and they create an extreme imbalance called dis-ease, a lack of growth. And it is that very dis-ease, that very lack of growth, that very pain from being all lined up in the wrong way with no balance, that creates the conscious rebellion and momentum within the human species to start leaning the other way. And once we start flowing the other way, joy, grace starts to come in. And of course we want that, so we go further and further down that road, A few yoga stretches helped my back. Now I'm going to do another yoga stretch. Now I'm going to do marathons. Now I'm going to do a marathon in every state and everything. Well, wait a minute. I've just broken my shins and bankrupted the savings account. Okay, no more marathons. So we lean into these trends back and forth. And until they get to the strong imbalance in the other way, we think it's a great idea. More is better. More is better. This is particularly in an either-or paradigm, which is why they're so dangerous. So this is just a symbol of the many, many layers of imbalances within imbalances within imbalances that are part of the cycle of life, the cycle of growth. And then this I will save for another time. And I want to thank you for joining me, for being present for our humanity in this time together.